A few months ago, I started noticing a shift in Jane's behavior. At first, I thought it might just be the stress from work or something else on her mind. But looking back now, I see how naive I was. Jane, my wife of 7 years, had started spending more and more time with her friends and at the gym. Yet, despite all that time, she never seemed to lose weight or make any new friends. Initially, I didn't think much of it. Why would I? I trusted her completely. She was my wife, the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. But little by little, that trust began to break down. It started with small things. Late nights, unexplained absences, and a new obsession with her phone. Jane would laugh at texts, quickly hiding the screen when I walked into the room. "It's just work stuff," she'd say with a smirk, her voice dismissive, almost condescending. I didn't want to push. I wanted to believe her, but that nagging feeling that something wasn't right started to keep me awake at night. Then came the excuses. So many excuses. "I'm going out with the girls," she'd say, or "I have to work late tonight." One of those late nights, I decided to surprise her with dinner and drove by her office. But when I got there, the parking lot was empty. My stomach sank. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she left early, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The tipping point came 2 weeks ago when a friend of mine, Mike, pulled me aside at a barbecue. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to say what he was about to. "Listen, man," he said quietly. "I saw Jane last Friday at that new restaurant downtown. She wasn't alone." My stomach twisted. "Who was she with?" I asked, my voice shaky. Mike hesitated before replying. I didn't recognize him, but they seemed pretty close. That night, I confronted Jane. I wasn't prepared for her complete lack of shame. She didn't even try to deny it. "What if I was with someone else?" she asked, her voice cold, her eyes full of contempt. "Maybe you should look at yourself, Mark. You're boring. You're predictable. You're not enough for me anymore." Her words sliced through me. I didn't know how to respond. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and utterly powerless. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but instead, I just stood there, numb, as she turned away and slammed the bedroom door behind her. That night, sleep was a stranger. Instead of resting, I stared at the ceiling, her words replaying endlessly in my mind. I knew I needed to do something, but what could I possibly do? How could I let her keep walking all over me like this? I was just a man struggling to hold together a marriage that was already falling apart at the seams. The following week, I began to pay closer attention to her actions. I noticed the way she spent hours getting ready before leaving, how she always seemed so upbeat when she walked out the door, yet distant and detached when she returned. I even realized she had stopped wearing her wedding ring. Then, last Friday, everything came to a head. Jane told me she was meeting her friends at a trendy new restaurant across town. I decided to follow her. I parked across the street from the restaurant, my hands shaking as I waited. When she arrived, I saw she wasn't alone. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped out of the passenger seat of her car and walked into the restaurant with her. They were laughing together, and she looked more alive than I'd seen her in years. The sight made my blood boil as they sat down at a table by the window. I wanted to storm in, confront her, and demand the truth right then and there. But I knew that would only give her the power. Instead, I thought of a different way. A petty act of rebellion that I hoped would make her realize just how far our marriage had fallen. I took off my wedding ring, placed it inside a small box, and wrote a note. "Since you clearly don't need this anymore, here's your freedom." My heart raced as I walked into the restaurant and handed the box to the waiter. "Please take this to the woman sitting at that table," I said, pointing toward Jane. Then I turned and left, waiting in my car, watching from a distance as the waiter made his way to their table. When Jane opened the box, her face drained of color. The man across from her looked puzzled, but Jane, she looked furious. What happened next was something I never anticipated. I stayed in the car, parked across the street, watching through the restaurant window as the scene unfolded. Jane's face went from pale to red as she read the note I'd left. Her companion, a smug-looking guy in an expensive suit, leaned in, trying to see what had upset her. She shoved the box into her purse and muttered something to him, her hands gesturing wildly. She looked livid. At first, the guy seemed confused, looking around as if trying to figure out what had just happened. Then, he leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he couldn't care less. That's when it hit me. This man wasn't just some random guy. He knew. He knew she was married. Hell, he probably enjoyed it. The urge to march in and wipe that smirk off his face was overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay in my seat. My grip on the steering wheel tightened so much that my hands began to ache. I tried to remind myself to breathe, to stay composed, but calm was the furthest thing from how I felt. After several tense minutes of their exchange, Jane grabbed her purse and stormed out of the restaurant. She looked furious, her face twisted in anger as she marched directly toward her car. Her companion followed her, Still smirking as though the whole situation was some sort of joke, I slouched down in my seat as they passed, my heart hammering in my chest. Once she reached her car, Jane whirled around and shoved him hard in the chest. I couldn't hear their conversation, but her body language spoke volumes. She was yelling at him. He raised his hands in a dismissive gesture and walked away, heading back toward the restaurant. Jane lingered there for a moment, pacing in front of her car, running her hands through her hair. She looked shaken, as if the gravity of what had just happened was finally catching up to her. Then, suddenly, she pulled out her phone and began dialing. I knew who she was calling before my phone even started to buzz. I stared at the screen, her name flashing on it, like my finger hovering over the decline button. I let it ring. When she called again, I let it ring once more. By the third call, I couldn't take it anymore. I answered, my voice calm but distant. "What?" I asked. "Mark, where are you?" She snapped, her voice dripping with both anger and desperation. "Why does it matter?" I replied, trying to keep my tone even, though my insides were seething. "Don't play games with me right now," she hissed. "You've humiliated me enough for one night. What the hell were you thinking, sending that to me in the middle of dinner?" "What was I thinking?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. "I was thinking, maybe it's time you stop pretending to be someone you're not. You're not my wife anymore, Jane. You're just someone who happens to live in the same house as me." There was a brief silence on her end, and for a moment, I wondered if she might actually apologize. But, of course, Jane being Jane, she went straight for the jugular. "You're pathetic, you know that?" she spat. "You can't handle the truth? That someone like me deserves more than you could ever offer. That guy," she continued, her voice filled with disdain, "he's a real man, Mark. Maybe if you were more like him, I wouldn't have to." Before she could say another word, I hung up. I sat in the car for a while, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. Anger surged within me. But beneath it all, something else simmered. Something I didn't want to face. Pain, hurt, betrayal. She had been my everything for 7 years, and now I didn't even recognize the person she had become. How had it all gone so wrong? How had the woman I loved turned into this cold, heartless stranger? Eventually, I started the car and drove home. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Jane's car was nowhere to be seen. I had no idea where she had gone, but honestly, I didn't care anymore. I walked into the house, poured myself a drink, and stared at the wedding photo hanging on the wall. I should have taken it down right there, but I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, staring at the smiling faces of the couple we used to be, questioning whether any of it had ever been real. A few hours later, I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. She slammed the door as she came inside, her heels clicking angrily on the hardwood floor. "Think this is funny?" she yelled as she stormed into the living room, humiliating me in front of everyone. I didn't even bother turning around. "You humiliated yourself," I said quietly, taking another sip of my drink. "You're such a child," she sneered. "I don't have time for this." "Then leave," I said, finally turning to face her. "Leave, Jane. Go back to your real man. I'm sure he'd love to have you." For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me, her mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to find a response, and then she laughed, a bitter, hollow laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't have the guts to get rid of me," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You're too weak. You need me, Mark. Without me, you're nothing." With that, she spun around and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, dumbfounded. But as I listened to her footsteps fade down the hall, something shifted inside me. I wasn't going to let her trample all over me anymore. The next morning, the atmosphere was suffocating. Jane moved around the house as though nothing had happened, sipping her coffee, scrolling on her phone, humming to herself. It was maddening. Her total lack of remorse, as if I didn't even matter, made my blood boil. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at her, trying to process how this woman, the same one who once made me laugh until I couldn't breathe, had become such a cruel, selfish person. "Are you seriously not going to say anything about last night?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She glanced up from her phone, raising an eyebrow as if I was the one who was inconveniencing her. "What do you want me to say, Mark?" she asked. "That I'm sorry, that I regret it?" "I don't. You're just going to have to get over it." Her words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to keep my composure. "Why are you still here, Jane? If you're so miserable, why don't you just leave? Go be with your real man." She rolled her eyes and took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. "Because I have nowhere else to go, genius. And let's face it, you'd fall apart without me. Someone has to keep this place running." I couldn't believe the arrogance, the nerve of her. "You're unbelievable," I muttered, standing up and walking out of the room. The rest of the day, I kept my distance from her, lost in thought, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't continue like this, living in a house full of lies and cruelty. But what could I possibly do? Every time I thought about asking her to leave, A voice in my head told me I wasn't strong enough. I kept thinking she would twist the situation and make me the villain. That night, I overheard her talking on the phone from the bedroom. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. Her laughter echoed through the wall, each chuckle a cruel reminder of everything I was losing. She was talking to him. The bitterness rose inside me. My fists clenched. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront her, get some sort of closure, even if it broke me in the process. I walked into the bedroom without knocking, catching her in the middle of her conversation. She looked at me, annoyed, and lowered the phone. "Do you mind? I'm in the middle of something." "I do mind," I snapped, my voice sharp. "Who are you talking to?" She didn't even flinch. "None of your business." "None of my business?" I repeated, my voice rising with anger. "You're still my wife, Jane. I think it's very much my business if you're sitting there laughing with your lover while I'm in the next room." She stood up, her face twisted with anger. "Don't play the wounded hero, Mark. You've never been enough for me. This marriage was a mistake, and deep down you know it." My stomach dropped, but I refused to let her see how deeply her words cut. "If that's how you feel, then leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Pack your things and go. I'm done." She crossed her arms, smirking. "You don't get to tell me what to do. I'll leave when I'm ready, not because you're throwing a tantrum." I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The suffocating feeling inside me only grew as I stood there, feeling like the walls of the house were closing in. I couldn't let her keep doing this to me. Something had to change. Sitting alone in the dark living room, staring at the empty walls, a thought began to form. A way to take control, to show her that I wasn't as weak as she thought. This wasn't the end. The next morning, Jane acted like nothing had happened. Once again, she sat at the kitchen counter in her silk robe, scrolling through her phone and sipping her coffee, completely unfazed by the destruction she had caused. I watched her from the doorway, my blood boiling. It was obvious she thought she had won, that I would just let her insults and betrayal slide. But something inside me had shifted overnight. I wasn't going to be her doormat anymore. Without a word, I left the house. I needed space, a plan, something that would give me the upper hand. I spent the morning driving around aimlessly, trying to clear my head, until I eventually ended up at a small diner on the outskirts of town. I ordered a coffee, took out my phone, and started making calls. First, I called a lawyer. I didn't know anything about divorce, but I wasn't going to let Jane keep walking all over me. I explained everything, and the lawyer assured me that I had options. Options that would make Jane's life very difficult if she didn't cooperate. Next, I called Mike, the friend who had told me about seeing Jane with another man. He hesitated at first, clearly uncomfortable getting involved, but after a bit of coaxing, he agreed to help. He promised to gather whatever information he could on her new boyfriend. A small sense of hope surged inside me as I hung up the phone. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had regained some control. I wasn't just reacting to Jane's games anymore. I was taking steps to end them. When I got back home that afternoon, Jane was gone. Probably out with her lover, I thought bitterly. Good. It gave me the time I needed to prepare. I went straight to our bedroom and started packing her things. I didn't want to be petty or dramatic. I just wanted her out of my life. I threw her clothes into suitcases, packed up her shoes, and even carefully boxed away her expensive makeup collection. As I worked, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. When I was done, I moved all her things into the garage and locked the door. I wasn't about to let her waltz back in and act like nothing had happened. That evening, Jane finally came home. She walked through the door, humming to herself, carrying a shopping bag from some expensive boutique. She barely acknowledged me as she set her things down and walked toward the bedroom. A few seconds later, I heard her scream, "Mark, what the hell is this?" I walked into the bedroom, casually leaning against the doorframe. "What does it look like?" I replied. "I packed your things. They're in the garage." Her face twisted in rage. "You did what? Who gave you the right to touch my stuff? Who gave you the right to humiliate me?" I shot back, my voice calm but firm. "You don't want to be here, Jane. You made that perfectly clear, so go. Leave, be with your real man," I said, my voice steady, watching as she stormed toward me, her eyes blazing with fury. "You can't just kick me out. This is my house, too," she yelled. I stepped closer, not backing down. "No," I replied firmly. "It's my house. I pay the bills, I put food on the table." "You haven't contributed a damn thing in years, Jane," I continued, my voice rising. "If you want to stay, you'll have to fight me for it. And trust me, I'm ready for that fight." For the first time in weeks, Jane seemed genuinely taken aback. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she spun around and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. I knew this was just the beginning of what was coming, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The The next few days were a whirlwind of tension and cold silence. Jane stayed in the house, but she barely spoke to me. When she did, it was only to hurl insults or snide remarks. "You're pathetic, Mark," she'd sneer. "You think you can scare me? You're a joke." I let her words roll off me, but inside, each one hit harder than I wanted to admit. I wasn't pathetic. I was furious, hurt, and determined to take back control of my life. I kept my eyes on the plan. Mike came through for me big time. He found out that Jane's lover was a guy named Kevin, a man she'd met through one of her so-called friends. Kevin wasn't some smooth, mysterious figure. He was a divorced insurance broker with a history of targeting married women. Mike sent me some photos of them together, taken at that same restaurant, and I could feel my blood boiling all over again. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, who assured me this could work to my advantage if Jane tried to make any claims in a divorce. The evidence gave me some satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. I wanted her to fully understand the gravity of what she'd done. I wanted her to see that I wasn't the weak, naive man she thought I was. That evening, I decided it was time to confront her once again. I walked into the living room where she was sprawled out on the couch, lost in her phone. "We need to talk," I said, standing over her. She didn't even look up. "About what, Mark? I'm busy." "About the fact that you've turned this house into a circus," I snapped. "About the fact that you've been cheating on me with some loser who preys on married women." Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "Don't you dare talk about Kevin like that," she hissed. I laughed bitterly. "Kevin? You mean the guy who's already ruined 2 other marriages? Yeah, he sounds like a real catch, Jane. You must be so proud," she spat. She jumped to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "You're just jealous because he's more of a man than you'll ever be." I took a step closer, my voice low and controlled. "If he's such a great man, why are you still here, Jane? Why haven't you packed your things and left? You've made it clear you're not happy." She paused for a moment, staring at me, her lips pressed tight in frustration. Then she smirked, a cold, calculating grin that sent a chill through me. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But I'm not going anywhere, Mark. Not until I'm ready. And when I do leave, I'll make sure you regret ever trying to stand up to me." Her words stung, but I refused to show any weakness. I kept my face unreadable. "We'll see about that," I muttered, turning on my heel and walking away. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the full weight of her words. I knew she wasn't going to leave on her own, and forcing her out would lead to a long, painful legal battle. But I refused to let her win. I needed a way to take control, to make her understand that there were consequences to her actions. As I drifted off to sleep, an idea began to form, one that would change everything. The next morning, Jane slipped back into her usual routine, lounging around in her robe, scrolling through her phone, pretending I didn't exist. But this time, I wasn't going to just sit back and take it. I had spent the entire night devising my plan, and now it was time to put it into motion. I walked into the kitchen, making sure my footsteps were loud enough to catch her attention. She glanced up briefly, but quickly returned her focus to her phone. "What do you want?" she asked flatly, irritation dripping from her voice. I ignored her question, grabbing my coffee mug. "Jane," I said, my voice calm but firm, "you need to pack your things and leave." She let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, here we go again. Mark, I told you, I'm not going anywhere. If you can't handle that, maybe you should be the one to leave." I smirked. "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. But I hope you enjoy your time here while it lasts." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood up, grabbed her coffee, and sauntered out of the room like she had just won some imaginary victory. As soon as she was out of sight, I grabbed my phone and dialed Mike. He picked up on the second ring. "It's time," I said, my voice steady. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked, his tone cautious. "Absolutely," I replied without hesitating. "She thinks she's untouchable. It's time she learned the truth." Mike hesitated for a moment before agreeing. "All right, I'll take care of it. You just focus on staying calm," Mike said before hanging up. I spent the rest of the day preparing for what was coming next. I moved through every room in the house, carefully documenting everything Jane had left behind. Clothes, shoes, jewelry, even in her absurd collection of designer handbags. I wanted a detailed record of everything in case she tried to make any moves later. That evening, I sat down at the dining table with my laptop and began typing. I wrote everything. How we met, how our marriage had unraveled, and the endless lies she had fed me over the years. I detailed her affair with Kevin, sparing no details. By the time I finished, I had written nearly 3 pages, but I wasn't done yet. I attached the photos Mike had taken of Jane and Kevin, looking so carefree and happy, completely unaware that they were being watched. Then I sent the entire document to her closest friends and family, with the subject line, "The truth about Jane." I knew it was a bold move, but I didn't care. I was done being the victim. If Jane wanted to tear apart our marriage, then I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly how it had happened. The fallout came quickly. Within an hour, my phone started blowing up with calls and messages from people I hadn't heard from in months. Some were shocked, others were furious, but all of them asked the same question. Is this true? And then there was Jane. She stormed into the living room, her phone in hand, her face bright red with fury. "What the hell did you do, Mark?" she screamed. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression as neutral as possible. "I told the truth." "You had no right," she yelled, throwing her phone onto the couch. "Do you have any idea what you've done? People are calling me, messaging me, accusing me of things," she added, her voice shaking. "Accusing you?" I repeated, standing up. "Jane, they're not accusations, they're facts. You cheated on me. You lied to me, and now everyone knows." She stared at me, her chest rising and falling with each breath, her hands clenched into fists. For a brief moment, I thought she might actually apologize, but as always, Jane did what Jane does best. She deflected. "You're pathetic," she spat. "This is why I needed someone like Kevin. He's a real man, not some whiny loser who can't handle the truth." Her words cut, but I didn't let it show. "If that's how you feel," I said calmly, "then maybe you should call Kevin and ask him to pick you up. Because I'm done. Jane, you're not welcome here anymore." She glared at me for what felt like an eternity before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, my heart racing, wondering if I had finally gotten through to her. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. That night, after I sent out the email exposing Jane, the house was unnervingly silent. She had locked herself in the bedroom, likely stewing over the fallout. I sat in the living room, sipping whiskey, scrolling through the barrage of messages from friends and family. Most were supportive, but some surprisingly criticized me, accusing me of airing our dirty laundry in public. One message, though, stood out. It was from Jane's mother, a woman who had never liked me and made no effort to hide it throughout our marriage. "Mark, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't the way to handle things. Jane deserves better than to be humiliated like this." I couldn't help but laugh. Better? She deserves better, I thought bitterly. The irony was almost too much to bear. Jane had destroyed our marriage with lies and betrayal, yet somehow I was the villain for simply telling the truth. The next morning, Jane finally emerged from the bedroom, her face pale but her eyes burning with anger. She slammed her coffee cup onto the counter, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. "You've ruined my life," she hissed. I leaned casually against the kitchen doorframe, unaffected. "You did that all on your own, Jane. Do you have any idea what people are saying about me?" she snapped. "My friends won't even answer my calls. My coworkers are giving me dirty looks. And Kevin, he's furious. He said I've made him look like a fool." That last part made me smile. "Sounds like a personal problem," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. Jane crossed her arms, her face hardening with cold calculation. "You think this is over? It's not. I'll make sure you regret this, Mark." But I didn't regret it, not for a second. That afternoon, I got a call from Mike. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Kevin's wife just called me." I nearly dropped my phone. "Kevin's wife?" I repeated, stunned. "Yeah," Mike confirmed. "Turns out he's married too. She found out about the affair from your email. She wants to meet up with you." I sat down, trying to process the bombshell. Kevin wasn't just a sleazeball, he was a hypocrite. It was almost poetic. "What does she want?" I asked. She didn't say much, but she sounded pissed. "I think she wants to compare notes." I agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop downtown. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was curious. If Kevin had been lying to his wife the way Jane had been lying to me, this meeting could expose even more layers of their betrayal. When I arrived at the coffee shop, a tall, elegant woman in her early 40s waved me over to her table. Her name was Lisa, and she wasted no time diving into the details of her husband's double life. "Kevin's been doing this for years," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "This isn't the first time he's had an affair, but it's definitely the most public. Thanks to your email, everyone knows now. My family, our neighbors, even his boss." I couldn't help but smile. "Sounds like he's finally getting what he deserves." Lisa nodded, her face softening. "He deserves worse, honestly, but I didn't come here to talk about Kevin. I came here to thank you." "Thank me?" I asked, confused. "For finally exposing him," she said. "I've been putting up with his lies for years, but this was the last straw. I'm filing for divorce." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. Divorce. It was something I had been avoiding, even though I knew it was coming. Hearing Lisa speak so decisively made me realize I needed to take that same step. "Good for you," I said, meaning it. The next hour was spent comparing stories, piecing together the timeline of Jane and Kevin's affair. It turned out they had been sneaking around for nearly a year, using the same excuses and lies to cover their tracks. The more I learned, the angrier I became. By the time I left the coffee shop, I felt an odd sense of camaraderie with Lisa. We were two people who had been betrayed by those we loved, but neither of us was going to let them get away with it. When I got home, Jane was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a scowl on her face. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "Out," I said simply, walking past her. She followed me into the kitchen, her tone growing sharper. "You're meeting with someone, aren't you? Don't think I don't know what you're up to, Mark." I turned to face her, my expression calm but resolute. "You don't know anything, Jane, and that's your problem. You've spent so much time lying and scheming that you can't even imagine anyone being honest with you." Her face twisted with anger. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" "I don't need to think it," I replied, my voice steady. "I know it." Her jaw dropped, but I didn't stay to hear her response. I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, seething and speechless. For the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. The following days felt like a storm was brewing, with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jane's anger simmered beneath the surface, and I could see her mind working overtime, trying to figure out her next move. But I wasn't worried anymore. I had a plan, and this time, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The days after my meeting with Lisa were a whirlwind of tension and decisions. Jane's anger simmered, and I could feel her resentment growing as I stayed calm and focused. She had expected me to beg her to stay, to fall apart in the face of her betrayal. But that was never going to happen. I had made up my mind. I was done. I began moving forward with the divorce. I'd already filed the paperwork, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell into place. Jane, of course, fought it every step of the way, throwing tantrums, trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty for exposing her lies. But it didn't work anymore. I wasn't that man anymore, the one who let her walk all over him. Her attempts to drag things out were futile. The lawyer I had hired helped me keep everything in order, making sure I was protected and that she wouldn't get the chance to take advantage of the situation. I focused on building my future, on the life I was about to reclaim, one that didn't involve deceit and betrayal. The day finally came when Jane and I had to meet in court. She showed up with her usual cold demeanor, but I could see the cracks beneath the surface. She was losing control, and it showed in her eyes. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. I stayed calm and composed, even when she tried to twist the narrative, to play the victim. But the evidence spoke for itself. Emails, photos, her own lies, and the judge saw through it all. I got what I deserved: a fair settlement, the ability to move on without being dragged down by her toxic presence. The moment the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mixture of relief and triumph. I was free, but I knew that was just the beginning. I had to rebuild, to heal, to reclaim everything I'd lost in that marriage. Jane, on the other hand, was left to face the consequences of her actions. The scandal had followed her, and the once cushy life she'd built on lies and manipulation began to crumble. Her friends, her family, those who once blindly supported her, started to question everything she had told them. The facade she had carefully constructed was no longer standing. As for me, I focused on the future. I invested more in my career and spent more time with friends who had stood by me, and rediscovered who I was outside of that toxic marriage. Every step forward felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of the life I deserved. I didn't just survive, I thrived. And as the months passed, I realized I was better off without her. Jane had tried to destroy me, but in the end, it was her own actions that had destroyed her. And now I could finally live the life I'd always dreamed of, one built on honesty, trust, and peace of mind. The past was behind me. The future was mine to create. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free.